Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. The following day, Mark found himself walking back into the same bistro, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe contrasted sharply with the stormy weather outside. Eleanor was already there, sitting in her usual spot, her posture poised and confident. Her eyes barely lifted from her tablet as she noticed him approach. "You've decided?" Eleanor's voice was calm, almost indifferent. Mark hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind replayed the conversation with his mother the night before. She had been so supportive, even if it meant sacrificing his pride. She was worried, but she also saw this as a chance for him to finally escape the financial burden that had been hanging over their heads for so long. He could take the risk, or continue struggling in silence. The answer seemed clear, but it still felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked for. "I'll do it," Mark said finally, his voice steady, though his hands betrayed his nerves as they gripped the edge of the table. Eleanor set down her tablet, her sharp blue eyes meeting his. "Good. We'll move forward immediately." She took out a folder from her bag, and slid a contract toward him. "Everything will be arranged. No turning back now, Mark. This is a business deal, nothing more." Mark stared at the contract, the harsh reality of his decision sinking in. He was about to sign away the one thing he had left, his dignity. But, if it meant security for his mother, a chance to make something of himself, was it really a choice at all? His hand hovered over the paper as he signed the contract, feeling a strange sense of finality. After he signed, Eleanor spoke again, her tone businesslike. "This will secure your debts, your future, but there are rules. You will live in my estate, attend events as my husband, and in return, I'll ensure your financial stability. But you will not interfere with my personal life, nor will there be any romantic involvement. This is purely a professional arrangement." Mark nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling deeper into his bones. He had no illusions about the nature of the contract. This wasn't about love. It was about survival. And, for the first time, he realized that he wasn't just signing a contract for his own sake, but for his mother too. It wasn't the future he had imagined, but it was a future nonetheless. "Now, you'll meet with my lawyer in the next few hours. We'll go over the formalities and prepare everything. You'll be moving in tomorrow," Eleanor added, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mark could only nod. The enormity of the change that was about to unfold made his head spin, but the decision was made. There was no turning back now. He had done what he needed to do for his family, and for himself. Later that evening, Mark stood outside his apartment building, staring up at the towering structure of Eleanor's mansion as a car pulled up to take him there. He felt like he was stepping into another world, a world he wasn't sure he belonged to. The mansion was grand, its marble pillars and sprawling grounds a far cry from the cramped apartment he had just left behind. As the car doors closed behind him, Mark's mind wandered to his mother. She was still at home, likely worrying about what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he had just taken the first step toward something different. The mansion loomed before him as the gates opened, and he stepped out of the car. Eleanor was waiting inside the grand entrance, her figure outlined by the soft lighting that bathed the room in a golden glow. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," Eleanor said coolly, her voice carrying a note of finality as she gestured for him to enter. The house was cold, sterile in its perfection, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the cafe where they had met. "This is your new home," she continued, leading him through the expansive hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. "We'll go over the schedule for the upcoming events tomorrow." For now, you should rest. You'll be needed for the gala in 2 days. Mark glanced around the enormous space, the silence of the house almost overwhelming. He had never imagined living in a place like this. The wealth and opulence were almost suffocating, but he couldn't deny the comfort it provided. It was a far cry from the days when he and his mother had barely scraped by. I'll make sure everything is arranged, Eleanor said as she turned toward him. Tomorrow we begin. Mark nodded, unable to find the words to express how he was feeling. But as he stepped into the lavish guest room, he realized that the world he had known was now a distant memory. Everything was different now: his life, his future, his very identity. And with that, the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him into a world that would change everything. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. The next morning, Mark woke up to the sound of distant voices and the soft hum of the mansion's high-end appliances. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. As his eyes opened and he saw the lavish decor of the guest room, it all came rushing back. He was now living in Eleanor's mansion, part of a life he never imagined he would be part of. It felt like a dream, but everything around him screamed reality. He slowly got out of bed, his mind racing with the gravity of his situation. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was overwhelming. The mansion was quiet, almost too quiet. It felt like a world that had no place for him, a world where he was just a pawn in someone else's game. But at least he wasn't struggling anymore. The debts, the worries about his mother's health, all of it was behind him now. Or so he thought. After a quick shower, he put on the clothes Eleanor had arranged for him, a tailored suit that fit perfectly, far better than any clothes he had ever owned. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. This was not the same Mark Davis who had been living paycheck to paycheck. This Mark was wearing someone else's life, someone else's identity. Mark walked downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the grand hallway. Eleanor was already there, sitting at the breakfast table, reviewing some papers. She glanced up briefly as he entered, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," Eleanor said, her voice as controlled as ever. "I trust you slept well." She didn't wait for his answer and continued, "Today we'll be attending the charity gala. There will be important people there. You'll need to act the part. I expect you to be presentable and follow my lead." She didn't offer a smile or any sign of warmth, just a calm, professional tone that left no room for doubt. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had no idea what he was supposed to do in this world. He wasn't part of it, and yet here he was, pretending to be. He wasn't sure how he would handle the upcoming gala, but he had no choice but to go along with it. After a quick breakfast, Eleanor led him to a sleek black car waiting outside. Mark couldn't help but notice how everything about this world was meticulously designed, from the perfect morning routine to the pristine car and even the flawless timing of everything. The drive to the gala was short, but Mark had time to reflect on how far he had come. Just days ago, he had been wondering how to pay rent, how to keep his head above water. Now, he was about to attend a gala full of the city's wealthiest and most powerful people. His life had been flipped upside down, but what was left for him to hold on to? As they arrived at the venue, Mark's nerves kicked in. The building was enormous, its marble columns and gold accents shining under the evening lights. He could already hear the hum of voices and soft music drifting from inside. He was out of his depth. But Eleanor walked confidently ahead of him, her presence commanding, and he had no choice but to follow her. Inside, the gala was everything Mark had imagined. The room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, glasses of champagne in hand, their laughter echoing off the walls. Eleanor moved effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with everyone she met. Mark followed, trying his best to blend in, but it felt like everyone was watching him, judging him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't belong in this world. Then, Eleanor stopped in front of a group of businessmen. Mark recognized one of them, Nathan, a well-known CEO of a rival tech company. Eleanor introduced Mark with her usual precision, her voice as smooth as silk. "This is Mark Davis," Eleanor said, her tone professional. "He's been a great help to me recently." She didn't mention the nature of their arrangement, of course, leaving Mark to feel even more like an outsider. "Mark, this is Nathan. He's been running the industry for years now. I'm sure you'll get along." She smiled politely, but there was no warmth in it. Mark shook Nathan's hand, feeling the pressure of the moment. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Nathan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's good to meet you, Mark," Nathan said, though his voice didn't sound entirely sincere. "I've heard a lot about you." He said it with a slight edge, as though he was trying to figure out just who Mark was. Mark couldn't help but feel like a fraud. This wasn't him, and yet here he was, playing a part he didn't know how to perform. The rest of the evening was a blur. Mark tried his best to follow Eleanor's lead, making small talk when necessary and staying in the background when he could. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The more he interacted with these people, the more he realized how much he didn't belong here. As the night wore on, Eleanor finally excused herself from the group and motioned for Mark to follow her. They stepped outside onto the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stuffy atmosphere inside. "How do you feel?" Eleanor asked, her eyes scanning the crowd below. I feel out of place," Mark admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You should. This is not a world for people like you," she said bluntly. "But remember, you agreed to this. You signed the contract." Her voice was cold, but there was something almost protective in it. Mark looked out over the city, the lights twinkling below. He had agreed to this, hadn't he? He had signed away his old life for a chance at something better. But as he stood there, he couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. As the days passed, Mark began to adjust to his new life in Eleanor's mansion, though every moment still felt surreal. The mansion, with its opulent decor and the staff that catered to his every need, was a far cry from his old apartment. He found himself slipping into a routine one dictated by Eleanor's schedule. He would attend social events with her, smile and nod through countless conversations with businesspeople he didn't know, and always follow her lead. But despite the luxury surrounding him, Mark could never quite shake the feeling that he was playing a part in someone else's life. The gala had been an eye-opener. Mark had been thrust into a world of power and wealth, and although he had been trying his best to keep up, he still felt like an outsider. Eleanor, on the other hand, fit right in. Her cool, collected demeanor was flawless as she moved through the crowd, exchanging polite pleasantries with influential people who treated her like royalty. He couldn't help but feel like a fraud as he stood beside her, posing as her husband. One morning, as Mark was getting ready for another day of attending business lunches and meetings, Eleanor entered the room, her expression unreadable. She was holding a stack of papers in her hands. "We have a meeting at the office later today. There are a few decisions I need you to review. We'll discuss them over lunch," she said, her voice steady and professional. Mark nodded, though he felt a strange unease in his chest. He was just a pawn in this arrangement, wasn't he? Eleanor didn't expect him to make real decisions, he was just there for appearances. But then, a small voice inside him wondered if there was more to this than he realized. Was she starting to trust him more than he thought? Or was this just another way for her to keep control of the situation? Later that day, at the office, Mark sat in a meeting room across from Eleanor, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. The room was sleek and modern, filled with glass walls and polished surfaces. He felt completely out of place here, surrounded by businesspeople who spoke in jargon he didn't understand. Eleanor, however, was right at home. Her confident, poised nature made her the center of attention in every conversation. She seemed completely in control, as if nothing in this world could shake her. "Mark," Eleanor said, breaking his thoughts. She looked up from the papers, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. "We need to make a decision about the merger. I want you to take a look at the numbers and let me know what you think." She slid the papers across the table to him, her hand resting lightly on them. Mark stared at the papers for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wasn't a business expert, and this was far beyond his knowledge. But he knew that Eleanor expected him to make some kind of contribution. He could either sit there and let her make all the decisions, or he could at least try to show that he was capable of more than just playing the part of her husband. Taking a deep breath, Mark glanced at the documents, trying to make sense of the figures in front of him. He wasn't sure how much help he could be, but something in him pushed him to give it a try. He started reading the numbers slowly, trying to follow the logic of the documents. As he read, he realized that despite his lack of experience, he had a knack for understanding patterns, and some of the projections seemed off. He felt a sense of pride in realizing that he wasn't as helpless as he thought. "I think there's a discrepancy here," Mark said, his voice steady, surprising even himself. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking to the papers he had pointed out. "Go on," she said, her tone encouraging. She didn't seem surprised, but Mark noticed a glimmer of interest in her eyes. Mark explained the issue he had found, pointing out the numbers that didn't seem to align with the rest of the data. As he spoke, he noticed Eleanor's expression shift from professional detachment to something that resembled approval. She nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed. "I see," Eleanor said after a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Well done, Mark. I wasn't expecting you to catch that." She stood up and gathered the papers. "This could change the direction of the merger. You've made a valuable contribution today." Her praise, though brief, meant more to Mark than he realized. In that moment, he felt a strange sense of validation. Maybe he wasn't as out of place in this world as he had thought. As they left the meeting, Eleanor walked beside him, her demeanor still cool and professional, but there was something different in her presence. There was an unspoken recognition that she was starting to see him as more than just a figurehead in her life. "You did well today," Eleanor said quietly, her voice almost softer than usual. "I don't give praise easily, but I believe you've earned it." Mark glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. He had always seen her as a woman of control, a person who didn't show much emotion. But there was something in her words that made him wonder if, just maybe, she was starting to trust him more than he had thought. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. As the days turned into weeks, Mark began to feel more and more like a part of Eleanor's world. The initial shock had worn off, and while he was still far from being fully comfortable in the opulent mansion, he was starting to adapt. Eleanor, too, seemed to take notice of the changes. The way he carried himself at social events, the small contributions he made at business meetings, it all seemed to make a difference. But even as his role in this strange partnership grew, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this arrangement than just business. One afternoon, as they were driving to another high-profile event, Eleanor turned to him, her gaze sharp and calculating. "I'm impressed with how you've been handling things," she said, her voice even but with a hint of something like approval behind it. "You've come a long way from the nervous man who signed that contract." She paused, watching him for a reaction. Mark looked at her, still unsure of where they stood. They had grown accustomed to their routine, but he couldn't quite figure out what Eleanor was really thinking. Was she starting to see him as more than just a business arrangement? Or was this still all about control? His mind raced with the possibilities, but he simply nodded in response, trying to keep his expression neutral. "I'm just doing my best," he replied, his voice steady. "I know this isn't exactly my world, but I'm trying to make it work." He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he pushed it down. He didn't have time to think about his own discomfort. He had a role to play, and that role was becoming more important every day. As the car pulled up to the venue, a sleek, glass building that housed the city's elite, Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly. "You're doing well, Mark." "Keep it up," she said, before stepping out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She was always in control, always a step ahead. But as Mark followed her into the building, he realized that something had changed between them. She was trusting him more, relying on him in ways he hadn't expected. Inside, the event was in full swing. People milled about, discussing business deals, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. Eleanor glided through the crowd effortlessly, her presence commanding attention wherever she went. Mark trailed behind her, still getting used to the world of luxury and power that surrounded him. But today, something felt different. As he moved through the crowd, he felt less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged here at least for the night. At one point during the evening, Eleanor introduced Mark to a group of potential investors. They were older men, dressed in expensive suits, with sharp eyes that seemed to size him up the moment he stepped into their circle. Eleanor stood by his side, offering the usual pleasantries and making introductions with the same grace she always did. But Mark, for the first time, felt like he was actually contributing to the conversation. He wasn't just there as a prop, a symbol of a marriage that wasn't real. He was speaking, offering insights, and holding his own. As the conversation shifted to the details of a new investment opportunity, Mark found himself speaking up, suggesting an idea he had come up with during one of the many business meetings he had attended with Eleanor. To his surprise, the investors took him seriously, nodding along as he spoke. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He felt a spark of pride as he realized he was no longer the nervous, overwhelmed man he had been when he first walked into this world. Later that night, as the event wound down and the guests began to leave, Eleanor turned to him, a glint of approval in her eyes. "Well done tonight," she said, her tone warmer than usual. "You handled yourself well with the investors." She paused for a moment, her gaze softening just slightly. "I think we're getting somewhere." Mark could hardly believe what he was hearing. The woman who had once treated him like little more than a business partner was now acknowledging his contributions. For a moment, he felt something stir inside him, a mix of pride, relief, and maybe something more. It was hard to tell what he was feeling, but one thing was certain: his relationship with Eleanor was shifting. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. There was something more beneath the surface, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. As they left the venue and stepped into the car, Eleanor spoke again, her voice low and contemplative. "You're more than just a husband for appearances now, Mark. I'm starting to see your value." The words were simple, but they held weight. Mark turned to look at her, but she was already looking out the window, her expression unreadable. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew one thing: things were changing. Whether it was for better or worse, he wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: he wasn't the same man who had walked into this mansion weeks ago. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. The days after the event passed in a blur. Mark was slowly finding his footing in Eleanor's world, but every day still felt like a performance. The business meetings, the social events, the constant expectation. She was always on edge, always questioning whether he was doing enough. Despite his growing sense of belonging in the circles he once only dreamed of, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. One evening, after another long day of events and business deals, Mark sat alone in the living room of Eleanor's mansion. The grand space felt empty without her. Eleanor had been gone for the night, attending yet another high-profile gathering. He had gotten used to her absence, the way she was always busy, always moving forward. It was what he had signed up for, after all. But now, in the silence of the mansion, he found himself wondering if he could ever truly fit in here, or if he was just a placeholder in a life he had never asked for. As he stared out the window, the city lights twinkling below, his thoughts wandered back to his mother. He hadn't seen her in days, and the guilt was starting to eat away at him. She had been proud of him when he made the decision to move into the mansion, to take the opportunity Eleanor offered. But was it worth it? Was it worth the cost of his soul? The more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he realized that she wasn't just a businesswoman, she was something else, someone with her own demons, her own struggles. He had caught glimpses of vulnerability in her, rare moments when her icy exterior cracked, but she never spoke of it. Just as he was lost in thought, the door to the living room opened, and Eleanor stepped inside, looking every bit the polished, confident woman he had come to know. She had a briefcase in her hand, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached him. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stood there watching him with an unreadable expression. You're still up, she remarked, her voice smooth, but there was something in it, something different. For a split second, it sounded almost like concern. Mark straightened up, trying to mask the emotional turmoil inside him. I couldn't sleep, he said, his voice betraying none of the conflict he was feeling. Eleanor nodded, then placed her briefcase on the table. I'm sorry for keeping you in the dark, she said, her voice softer than usual. I know this whole arrangement hasn't been easy for you. But you've been handling everything better than I expected. You've stepped into a life that wasn't yours, and you've done it without complaining. She paused, her eyes searching his face. That deserves some credit. Mark blinked, surprised by her words. Eleanor had never been this direct with him before, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. His feelings about her were conflicted. He knew that she was kind to him in her own way, but that kindness was always hidden beneath layers of business and control. I'm just doing what I have to, he replied, unsure if he was telling her the truth or just trying to convince himself. There was a brief silence before Eleanor spoke again, her voice almost inaudible. Do you ever wonder why I offered this deal to you? Why I asked you to marry me? Her gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, as if she were weighing the words carefully. Mark stared at her, unsure of where this conversation was going. I've wondered, Mark admitted, his voice quieter now. But I thought it was just business. You needed someone to fill a role, and I was there. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. I thought it was simple. No emotions. No complications. But now, I don't know. He exhaled sharply, a mix of frustration and confusion building up inside him. Eleanor looked up, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that caught him off guard. It wasn't just business, she said softly, her words almost too quiet to hear. I could have asked anyone. I could have gotten 100 men to pretend to be my husband for the sake of appearances. But I didn't. I chose you, Mark. Because you reminded me of someone I used to care about. Her voice faltered slightly at the end, and Mark felt a pang of sympathy. For the first time, he saw a crack in Eleanor's perfect facade. Mark felt his heart race as he processed her words. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. There was something more, something he hadn't expected. Eleanor had feelings, hidden beneath the ice, and he had unknowingly stepped into a role that was more complex than he ever imagined. He stood up, moving closer to her. I didn't know, he said quietly, his voice full of understanding. But now I do. He reached out, almost instinctively, as if wanting to close the distance between them. Eleanor didn't pull away, but she didn't embrace him either. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes never leaving his. We both have our reasons for being here, Mark, she said softly. And maybe, just maybe, we're both looking for something more than what we've been pretending to want. She paused before adding, but it's complicated. And we both know that. Her voice was firm, as if she was trying to hold on to control. Mark nodded slowly, a sense of clarity settling over him. Things were changing, slowly but surely. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he could feel the shift between them. They were no longer just two people pretending to be something they weren't. They were beginning to understand each other, piece by piece. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. The next few days were filled with a new kind of tension. Mark could sense that something had changed between him and Eleanor. They were no longer just business partners trapped in a marriage of convenience. There was something deeper now, a connection that neither of them fully understood yet. But the air between them was thick with unspoken words, and the once cold distance that defined their relationship was slowly beginning to dissolve. One evening, after another day of meetings and events, Eleanor returned to the mansion later than usual. Mark was sitting in the study, looking out at the city lights from the large windows. He was trying to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to their conversation a few days ago. He wondered what had made Eleanor choose him for this arrangement, and more importantly, why he felt like he was beginning to care for her. As Eleanor entered the room, Mark turned to face her, but she didn't immediately meet his gaze. Her shoulders were tense, and for the first time, she seemed to carry the weight of something more than just business. She walked toward him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, but there was something about her, something vulnerable that made Mark's heart skip a beat. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something that sounded like uncertainty. "I need to tell you something." He set the papers down on the desk, his full attention now on her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. She just stood there, her back straight and her arms crossed, as if gathering the strength to say what had been on her mind. Mark watched her, waiting for her to open up, but he didn't push her. He could feel the change in the air, the shift in their dynamic, but he knew that it had to come from her. Finally, Eleanor sighed deeply and moved to sit beside him at the desk. "I've been thinking a lot about this," she began, her voice soft. "About everything. About us." She paused, looking away for a moment before continuing. "I've never been good at trusting people. I've always kept people at a distance, and I thought I could control everything if I did that." She glanced at him then, her eyes softening slightly. "But you," she shook her head, as if unsure of how to finish. Mark's heart raced. He had heard those words before, but hearing them from Eleanor, in this quiet, vulnerable moment, made them hit differently. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, but he held back, waiting for her to finish. "You've shown me something different," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've made me feel things I wasn't ready to feel. And now, I don't know what to do with it." She met his gaze, her eyes full of emotion that she rarely let show. "I don't know how to navigate this, what we've built here. It's not just a business deal anymore. It's complicated." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Eleanor might finally reveal what was in her heart. But instead of saying the words he expected, she was just as uncertain as he was. "I don't know what this is either," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter to me. I don't want to be just a part of your deal anymore, Eleanor. I want something real." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, but he didn't take it. Instead, he let the silence between them speak for itself. For a moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. But then, to Mark's surprise, she slowly moved closer, her hand brushing against his. The touch was light, but it felt like an unspoken promise, a promise that they were no longer just two people stuck in a contract. They were beginning to find something more. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now," Eleanor said softly. "Maybe we can just see where this goes." Her voice was quieter now, and for the first time, Mark saw a side of her that was more human than business. Mark nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a confession of love or a promise of anything concrete, but it was something. It was a step forward, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this strange journey. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. As the weeks went by, things between Mark and Eleanor continued to evolve. Their relationship, once strictly professional and transactional, was now becoming something more complex. There were still moments of uncertainty, still times when Mark would catch himself wondering if he was making the right choice, but something had shifted. Eleanor was no longer just his employer or his wife for appearances. She had become someone he could trust, even if she hadn't fully let go of the walls she had built around herself. One evening, Mark was sitting in the study when Eleanor entered. She was holding a folder in her hand, the kind of business folder that Mark had seen countless times, but tonight, there was something different about her. She didn't look like the cold, composed woman he was used to. She looked tired, worn down, even. Her eyes were distant, and for the first time, Mark saw a crack in her perfect exterior. "Mark," Eleanor said softly, her voice quieter than usual. "I need to talk to you about something important." She walked over to the desk and set the folder down in front of him. Mark looked at her, sensing the weight of her words. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward in his chair, his gaze locked on hers. Eleanor took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for something difficult. This business, everything we've been building, it's becoming harder to manage. Not because of you, she added quickly, but because of my own personal issues. There are things I've kept from you, things I haven't wanted to face. But I think it's time I tell you. She paused, looking down at the folder as if it held the answers she had been avoiding. Mark sat silently, watching her closely. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty that had been building between them. She had always kept her emotions hidden, always remained composed, but now she was letting him see something else. A vulnerability. Something real. I've been keeping secrets, Mark, Eleanor continued, her voice low. Things that go back years. My family, my past, it's all been tied up in this business. I thought if I kept everything under control, I could avoid dealing with the pain. But now it's all crashing down, and I don't know what to do anymore. I've built an empire, but at what cost? Her eyes met his then, filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. Mark felt a pang in his chest as he listened to her. He had known there was more to Eleanor than just the powerful businesswoman. But hearing her admit she had never expected it. He didn't know how to comfort her, or even if she wanted comfort. But he couldn't just stay silent. Eleanor, you don't have to do this alone, Mark said, his voice steady but filled with concern. I'm here. I may not have all the answers, but you don't have to carry this by yourself. He wasn't sure where the words were coming from, but in that moment, he meant them with every fiber of his being. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, finally, she spoke again, her voice a little more fragile than before. I know I've pushed you away. I know I've kept my distance. But you've been there for me in ways I never thought possible. Maybe I was wrong to shut you out. Maybe it's time I let you in. She reached for his hand, the gesture simple but meaningful, and for the first time, Mark felt like they were on the same side. For the first time since they had started this arrangement, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Eleanor had never been someone who showed her emotions openly. She had always been the one in control, always the one pulling the strings. But now, here she was, letting him in, letting him see the real Eleanor, the person behind the businesswoman. As they sat there, hands clasped together, Mark realized that he wasn't just part of her plan anymore. He wasn't just a pawn in her game. He was someone she trusted. Someone she cared about. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to feel the same way. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship began to evolve into something neither of them had expected. What had started as a marriage of convenience was now becoming more complicated, more real. Eleanor's walls were coming down, little by little, and Mark found himself learning more about her than he ever imagined. The connection between them, though still fragile, was beginning to grow stronger. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Eleanor and Mark found themselves back at the mansion, sitting together in the quiet of the living room. The atmosphere was different now, more relaxed, more genuine. It was a contrast to the tense, professional meetings of their earlier days. Mark sat across from Eleanor, watching her as she stared out the window, her expression distant. You know, I never thought I would end up here, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice soft. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. When I first asked you to marry me, I thought it was just a business arrangement. I thought it was just a way to maintain control. But now... She paused, her gaze softening. Now, I can't help but wonder what might happen if we let go of all the rules. What if this wasn't just about survival? What if there was something more here, something real between us? Mark felt a tightness in his chest. The words she spoke echoed the thoughts that had been running through his mind for days. He had spent so much time trying to make sense of this strange partnership, trying to fit into a world that wasn't his own. But now, as Eleanor spoke, he realized how much he had changed, how much he had grown. I've wondered the same thing, Mark admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I've been afraid of what this might mean, afraid of letting myself feel something real. But now, I don't think I can ignore it anymore. What we've built here, it's not just a contract anymore. It's us, Eleanor. It's something more than just two people fulfilling an obligation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that had taken months to develop. Eleanor's gaze never left his, and in that moment, Mark saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before: vulnerability. She wasn't the unshakable businesswoman anymore. She was just a person who had let him in. Finally, Eleanor stood up, walking slowly toward him. "I've been afraid too," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of what this might mean, afraid of losing control. But I'm starting to think that maybe it's okay to let go." She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it came to rest on his. Mark stood up to meet her, his heart racing. He took her hand in his, the warmth of her touch sending a surge of emotion through him. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending that this isn't real, that we're not real. Maybe we're ready to start something new together." His words hung in the air, as if the weight of everything they had been through was finally being acknowledged. Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes shimmering with something that was more than just admiration. "Maybe we are," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. They stood there for a moment, simply holding hands, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing second. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt at peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a pawn in a game. He was a partner, an equal, and perhaps even something more. As they stood in the silence of the grand living room, Mark realized that their journey was far from over. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it would be real. And that, he thought, was all that mattered. Stay tuned for the next part of the story.